Hello, I'm Craig Rotzler, Senior Conference Manager with CenterWatch, and welcome to today's webinar on ICH E6 R3. How can we prepare for another significant revision in GCP regulations when we're still adopting ICH R2? This webinar is brought to you by the Avoca Group. We're expecting this session to last about 45 minutes, followed by a live question and answer session. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Feel free to prepare questions for our presenters. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the presentations, and the questions will be addressed at the end. To ask a question, simply type your question in the area provided and press enter, and questions will not be viewable to other attendees. I would now like to turn the floor over to Chrissy McDonald, Vice President of Client Delivery at the Avoca Group. Chrissy, go ahead.
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As Craig said, I'm Chrissy McDonald, the Vice President of Client Delivery here at the Avoca Group. And I'm here today to present with my colleague Steve Whitaker, a Senior Consultant at the Avoca Group. Before we begin, I just want to share a little bit about the Avoca Group to give some background on the information we're going to share with you about today's presentation. The Avoca Group's been dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process for over 20 years. We do this by helping companies develop and implement quality and compliance standards throughout their organization, whether it's through our consulting, our online learning, membership in our consortium, the Diligent vendor qualification platform, or giving presentations like this one today. Our mission is to help companies increase quality, ensure compliance, and improve efficiency so that ultimately, as an industry, we can help get medicines to patients faster. So the Avoca Quality Consortium is a collaborative of pharma, biotech, and clinical service provider companies that all have the shared objective of elevating clinical trial quality and driving efficiency in clinical trial execution. So since its inception in 2011, we've had more than 450 leading practices developed within the construct of the consortium. The leading practices are available within the AQC Knowledge Center to individuals and member companies, and that includes full access to the guidelines, tools, templates, standards, and process documents, as well as AQC research and archived webinars. The slide you see here represents the more than 120 current pharma, biotech, CRO, and clinical service provider companies that are members of the consortium today. If you see your company's name on the logo and you don't have access to our Knowledge Center, please feel free to reach out to us after the webinar and we can get you your credentials. If you don't see your company's logo here and you're interested in membership, again, please contact us after the webinar for some information. Moving on to our agenda for the day, we're actually going to be reviewing the ICH E6 R3 revision concepts, the regulatory guidance influences for the ICH E6 R3 revision, the technology drivers, as well as the implications of COVID-19 on the revision, and lastly, the stages of authoring and publishing for this ICH E6 R3 guidance. So in terms of revision concepts and why it's important, if you recall, ICH E6 was released in 1996. A few years ago, there was a large impact in the industry as we tried to adjust to ICH E6 R2, as it was the first revision to the guidance on clinical trial conduct in 20 years. So what we're now looking at is another revision, but this time it's only 5 years from the previous. So what we're seeing is a shrinking timeline of regulatory guidance revisions that's likely related to the rapid changes in technologies and clinical trial design approaches as we move to make technology a part of clinical trial execution and increase efficiency. So as a result of this increased frequency in guidance revisions, we're going to have to become more adept at adjusting our policies and procedures to comply with these newly changing regulations. Despite ICH E6 R2 being released, it's pretty well known that there's still industry-wide issues with complying to the risk-based approaches and quality tolerance limits as an example. And as you'll see today, compliance with R2 is going to greatly impact your ability to be compliant with ICH E6 R3. So the focus of today's discussion is actually going to be around this ICH E6 R3 final concept paper that was published back on November 17th of 2019. So while the full draft of the document is not yet out, the concept paper states that the GCP guidance will be fully rewritten and reorganized. And the focus is actually going to be twofold. So firstly, to address the applications of GCP principles to the increasingly diverse trial types and the data sources that are being employed to support regulatory and healthcare-related decision-making on drugs. And ultimately to provide flexibility whenever appropriate to facilitate the use of technological innovations in clinical trials. So the development of this piece will address the complexities of clinical trials in the current global regulatory climate. And secondly, the guidance will retain the concepts and guidance in R2, but will expand, modify, and reorganize to provide scientific and ethical guidance that will allow diverse approaches to a variety of clinical trial designs and innovative technologies to basically ensure that the approaches outlined in the guidance are both relevant and adaptable to today's operational approaches. Similarly, the revision is going to address some gaps or inconsistencies that the FDA has recognized, that the regulatory bodies have recognized exist in current ICH guidances. So ICH E6R3 is going to be released in parts, and when it's complete, it'll set out principles that will be aligned with those set out in ICH E8R1, which is the draft revision of the general considerations for clinical studies. So E6R3's first release with Annex 1 will replace the current ICH E6R2 and will be the overarching principles and objective document that also discusses interventional clinical trials and the good clinical practices associated with these types of trials. When Annex 1 is complete, Annex 2 will commence, which will address some of the non-traditional interventional clinical trial approaches and technologies. So many of these regulatory guidance influence for the revision have been addressed in the concept paper, but we'll look further into some of those that we suspect will be a part of that as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Steve to discuss some of these influencers.
Thank you, Chrissy. And so what we're going to actually transition into now is to look closely at the regulatory guidance influences for this revision. Again, as Chrissy says, why is this revision happening so quickly? Well, as was mentioned, if we look closely at that final concept paper from the 17th of November 2019, it references many specific driving guidances that relate to that. So there's complexity, as we all know, across all the ICH guidance documents. But there's more than that. There's also agency-specific documents that are referenced. And so we're going to look at those, and we're going to do some deep dive into these, understand what those influences are so that we can have some understanding of what is likely to change in E6. So as we look at those influences, you'll see in green here reflected the guidances that ICH has published or is in the process of modernizing. So ICH E6R2 continues to be a factor. It will be a very important part that the factors of the changes in R2 will be retained in R3. But it's also going to accommodate the modernized E8, and then also it's driven by the ICH Q9 quality by design principles. Those we know were largely initially developed for GMP, but they've been adaptable to the GCP setting. You'll see in orange that there's also drivers from the FDA, especially around risk-based approaches, as they're referencing the 2012 materials that have come from the FDA in that regard. The EMA also has a reflection paper on risk-based quality management in clinical trials. So that's referenced. So we're going to be looking at that and say, what's the content there that largely might be incorporated into R3? And then finally, in purple here, you will see that MHLW PMDA from Japan has three materials, three guidances that are referenced. There's a revision of the guidance for the Ministerial Ordinance on GCP for drugs. There's the basic principles of quality management in clinical trials, and there's the basic principles of risk-based monitoring. All of those have been recently published in 2019. So we're going to dive into those. We're going to look at those in a contextual aspect to make sure that we understand the content. I'm going to first start with ICH E6 Revision 2. Most of this, I'm assuming the majority of you are very familiar with, because this is where the industry has focused in recent years to understand what we need to do to adapt to become compliant with E6 R2. But I'm going to pull out and extract the relevant pieces that almost certainly will be retained for R3. So we're going to be looking to understand whether we've fully been successful adopting R2 to be compliant, and therefore, are we ready for R3 in that context? Obviously, R2 focuses on proactive quality management. It does incorporate quality by design principles. And the factors related to that is that it focuses on risk through planning and driving toward early signaling and the mitigations of the problems. It recognizes that data are now available more real time than what they were when ICH E6 was originally published, meaning that we have EDC systems, we have ePro systems, we have electronic availability of lab data and other information that is available real time. So how are those data rapidly analyzed, evaluated, so that from a patient safety data interpretability standpoint, we have early ability to detect and understand whether pre-established tolerance limits are being impacted and whether we need to make decisions rapidly and concurrently with the incoming data. So the industry has been focusing on the quality tolerance limits. What does that look like? That's been a challenge for the industry to adopt, but we'll look more closely at that. Also, then, how does that use risk reviews? So in addition to initially developing risk plans at the beginning, it establishes the requirement for ongoing constant risk reviews and the documentation of those risk reviews and the documentation of executed mitigations and contingencies as a result of that. It does continue to drive the requirements for root cause analysis and evaluating the emergent causes and the corrective actions related to that. There are risk-based strategies that it drives, so that it's saying not all risks are equivalent, and therefore it is wanting to drop down to make sure that you have commensurate risks relative to the risks that matter, and you focus on dominantly on those that have greater impact to patient safety and data interpretability. You need to have that documented up front as far as the chosen strategies, the roles, responsibilities that you're going to use to manage those, and how you're going to monitor and provide oversight. They expect it to be dynamic rather than a static system. Again, dynamic because of the ongoing constant review of new data and information as it arises and as it comes in. And it relates not only to risk-based monitoring. A lot of times people limit their thinking to monitoring, but it's also for oversight, whether it's oversight of vendors, providers, investigative sites, and other organizations, even risk-based approaches for inspection and audit approaches, quality management systems, and things of that nature. From an oversight perspective, the accountability for quality is restated. It has always been this case, but strongly restated that the sponsors and the investigators retain accountability. Now, providers will still be responsible for a lot of those activities, but the ultimate accountability goes back to the sponsors and the investigators. As I mentioned before, E6R2 does focus on the electronic systems and the fact that those will be used to do the ongoing risk-based evaluations. Therefore, the validation and the quality control of those systems become a primary focus as well. It does implicitly advise that our industry should move away from paper-based systems. because those are not the dynamic systems. They do not provide the real-time data and information that they're trying to drive toward in terms of managing patient safety and data interpretability. Serious breaches, as has always been the case, gets restated firmly within E6R2 around informing regulators in a timely fashion based on local authority requirements, and that non-compliance must be a major factor of managing quality. Finally, E6R2 focuses on the essential records. We're all familiar with the ALCOA historical acronym, which stands for the attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And E6R2 added the requirement for those to be complete. And that there must be some aspect regarding the availability of those essential documents, again, in a real-time basis, and having those recorded through electronic trial master files or other approaches that indicate that you're managing those activities real-time in a compliant fashion. It also enhances that not only are patient data and lab data and things of that nature essential documents, but process documents such as risk plans, risk reviews, documented risk decisions become essential documents and require the traceability of decision-making for those to be incorporated. They also must document how risk management oversight is exercised. So if you're building those risk plans and the mitigations into your monitoring plans, your integrated quality management plans, your data management plans, or other plans, that all has to be clearly articulated and designated as your quality management systems. The monitoring activities, again, should be traceable and documented, and it also clarifies that at the end of each trial, your effectiveness of your risk management plan should be documented in your clinical study report. So again, hopefully all of you are very familiar with these. What we're going to ask you now is we're going to be going to polling questions to get a sense for how here in 2020, now that these guidelines have been out for a few years, how well have we already successfully adopted those types of capabilities? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to now go to a polling question. So we're going to open up this polling question, and it is related to the following. What percentage of your clinical trials have successfully completed the full adoption of E6R2 within your organization and with your providers, your vendors, your CROs, et cetera? So I'm going to open the polling question now. So I will start that, and you will have some time here to be able to respond. It is now open. Responses are still coming in, so I'm going to give just another moment. I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, I'm closing the poll. I will publish the results. And at this point, you should see the results. There are 188 who have responded to indicate that 75 to 99% of their trials have that. So that's 31% of the respondents. 22% of the respondents say that it's only been applied to 50 to 74%. Only 8% of respondents have indicated that 100% of their trials have E6R2 applied. And then there's another 17% who are between 0 to 49%. So there's still a significant percent that are down in the range where they have significant numbers of trials that still need to be modified or adapted to accommodate E6R2. Now what I'm going to do is to transition back over to the next polling question. We have a second polling question. So where ICH E6R2 adoption has not occurred, which we saw from the prior question, has been the case in many studies, what are the top 2 pain points that you experience in implementation that have prevented that from occurring? I'm going to go back. I'm going to now transition to the next polling question, and I'm going to start that poll now. It is open for you to respond to. The responses are coming in quickly, so I'll give a few more moments. Okay, I will give 5 more seconds. Okay. I'm now going to publish the responses. As you should be able to see, 27% indicate that risk-based management is the greatest adoption challenge or pain point. 21% have had challenges with the QTL implementation, the quality tolerance limits. Another 19%, so 1 out of every 5, have challenges with organizational change management and training for the adoption of that. And then there are still significant challenges with policy procedure updates, with 17%, indicating that that is a significant pain point, and 16% having vendor oversight as being a challenge for this as well. So some interesting findings from that. So we're going to go back then to the slides. And then with that, we're going to now dive more deeply into other drivers for the changes for E6R2. So as I indicated on a prior slide, there are other references within the new concept paper for E6R3 that indicate that there's general considerations for clinical trials. Those come from the modernized ICH E8 and then also from the recently published PMDA guidance. I'm going to go through some of these to give you a double-click perspective of what some of those things are. So it provides, those documents provide international principles or practices for the design and conduct of clinical studies. So what's the acceptance of data and the results by authorities? In other words, what they're setting guidelines to say, what will we accept when you submit a market authorization application for review? So what are the acceptance requirements that you need to consider? So you have to realize that's also going to be further incorporated into E6R3 in order to understand how that will be achieved. It also provides guidance on quality in design and conduct of the actual studies. So for study planning, what are the critical to quality factors, the CTQ factors? And then how are you managing the risks to the CTQ factors? So again, they're wanting you to prospectively identify what are the most relevant critical to quality factors, whether it's for patient safety, data interpretability, and based on that, what's the rigor and the diligence that you apply to the risk-based approaches to manage those risks throughout the conduct of the trial. It also focuses on the types of clinical studies performed and the product life cycle. And this is going to be a major factor when we look at some of the drivers for the change in R3, because there are now many new clinical study types. We're going to get into what those new study types might look like, what they already are, as some of them are beginning, and what those implications might be for the protection of study subjects. So as an example, if you're using pragmatic trials, you're looking at real-world data and real-world evidence. How do you manage protection of study subjects? As you look at complex protocol designs, we're going to get into some of those as well. What does that do for the protection of study subjects? What does it do for the integrity of the data? What might the risks be that you need to manage for the reliability of the results and the ability of the studies to be able to meet their objectives? So they're looking closely at that, especially with the new types of interventional trials that are being driven by some of the changes. It also references within ICH E8, the new modernized guidance for Annex 2 and Annex 3. And Annex 2 focuses on considerations for clinical trials, and it gives further details around the design and analysis, around the conduct and reporting, around safety reporting, around populations that are considered and how those are managed, around genetics and genomics. And Annex 3 focuses on actually connecting and linking examples of critical to quality factors that get called out specifically in all of the ICH guidances, whether that's E3, E4, E5, all the way up to many, many additional guidances that have been out. So E8R1 maps those and shows the relevance of each of those as you're conducting clinical trials. So it's important to look closely across those as we consider the changes that will be driven into E6R3. As we then look at the ICH Q9, those focus on risk-based approaches. We know that these are principles that were first developed for GMP, but they are very applicable for GCP. And in fact, this is an iconic image that came out of ICH-Q9 around the requirements to do the aspects of risk assessment that include aspects of risk identification, analysis, and evaluation, and then how you do risk control, which risks you're going to reduce, which you will accept based on the impact those risks have, and some kind of assessment of the impact of those risks. And then finally, what's the risk review, and how do you document those, and how do you communicate those? And on the right, what's the overall risk management tools and activities that you're using to manage that? So the ICH Q9 came out before ICH E6 revision 2, and a lot of the context of Q9 has already been built into E6R2. In addition to that, as we look at the EMA reflection paper and the MHLW and PMDA guidances on these, they also further expand on this. And therefore it says, what is the risk assessment, which includes, again, identification, evaluation, the risk control for mitigation acceptance. This is where the quality tolerance limits came in, and how do you do risk review and reporting. So you can see the similarity and commonality of these guidances relative to ICH Q9, and also the further enhancements that were incorporated into E6R2. So those are still going to be very relevant and very applicable. There have been further guidances that have focused on risk-based monitoring. Again, remember, risk-based monitoring is only one component of risk-based approaches, but because risk-based monitoring and monitoring of investigative sites is so important, especially relative to patient safety and data interpretability, it has established a lot of further guidance materials from FDA, from PMDA, and from others as well that get pulled into this concept paper that says they're going to drive the changes for E6R3. So what are the specifics and the approaches for on-site monitoring? For centralized monitoring? For source data verification. In this source data verification, we have heard loud and clear during the COVID-19 circumstance that has been a significant pain point now that the access to investigative sites has been significantly restricted and limited. And in many cases, source data verification is very difficult or is not permitted based on guidances, especially within the European region. Due to privacy, which is also listed here, that cannot be done virtually or remotely. And so that becomes an opportunity and a challenge to understand how these new guidances can be adopted, reflected, and how we can develop approaches to do that that are consistent with the implications of requirements for source data verification and privacy. It also is consistent with critical to quality factors that it says we should identify critical data and processes. We need to do the risk assessments for monitoring, and the monitoring plans must be built to incorporate all of that to be able to be consistent with that. So we know that these factors are going to be built into E6R3. So as we looked at all of those, so those are the guidances that are driving the changes for R3. But that alone is not the only factors that are driving the change for E6R3. Clearly in their concept paper, they say that technology drivers are going to be a major reason why they feel they need to adopt and adapt quickly new guidances within the 5-year time frame following E6R3. So things are happening quickly, especially in the realm of technology. So as we look at technology and we look at references that were made within the concept paper, the aspect of that is that general overviews. This, what you're seeing now, comes from a PMDA presentation, which was their symposium for the draft ICH E8R1 updates. And this presentation was from July of 2019. So you can see that the regulatory agencies are beginning to look at concepts of horizon scanning. What is horizon scanning? So if you look at the top of this diagram, they recognize where they have failed in the past and where they have been behind the 8 ball, so to speak, meaning that without horizon scanning, the stakeholders, being pharma companies, biotech companies, CROs, even technology companies, the investigative sites, are unsure of what regulations might be driving and how to interpret them, especially in the concept of the use of these new technologies and innovative approaches. So there are reports on technologies, and regulators, though, they tend to be lagging, they're late, they're not clear in terms of the implications. So regulators cannot keep pace with those accelerating innovative technologies. So what they're looking to do is to expand their focus and approach on how they can do more effective horizon scanning. So they're going to be scoping and looking very closely at those emerging technologies. They want to be more proactively scanning the horizon for the emerging technologies and making necessary regulatory preparations to achieve that. This is a major factor that's driving E6R3. So an illustration of this gets further established here by what was published with DIA and the PMDA around the concept of a funneling approach, where what you would first identify the pool of all the novel technologies that are out there. But knowing that some of those technologies will have greater implications for patient safety, data interpretability, the probability and the extensiveness of their use will be more significant. The implications that they have for market authorization applications and other factors will be taken into account, such that they will prioritize those novel technologies and begin to allow the focus on a subset of those technologies. So what might they be? Do we as an industry have the ability to influence what those should be? Can we help the regulators know what we are likely to use, how we're going to use them, and the way we would like to use them? So the assessments will include the ability then to have more detailed, effective reports, especially on the technologies that matter the most. And as a result of that, then the regulatory agencies are indicating that they will then disseminate regulatory actions as a result of those assessments. So they'll present them to management, and as a result of that, those will be the drivers to issue guidances on technology. So as you see the timeline that we're going to be showing you here shortly for when E6R3 will be published, between now and then, we can assure you that the regulatory agencies will be doing this horizon scanning, and that will be a driver for the guidances that will be coming out with E6R3. So now that the regulatory agencies are indicating that this is their approach, how do we partner with them in evaluating this and assessing this? So if we look at innovative technology, we want to look at multiple things, such as adaptive trial designs. So as you think of adaptive trial designs, those have complexities, unique features to them. It has lots of things that happen real time. The data are coming in real time, and based on the data, you're making choices and decisions about changing treatment groups, adjusting the groups, adjusting where patients are in those treatment groups, etc. So again, it has risks for patient safety. It has opportunity for patient safety. It has risks for data interpretability. It has opportunities for that. So how do we use those designs in an effective fashion, and how do regulators in the industry work collaboratively to make sure that we have the ability to understand how to use that effectively? What about devices? We all know that devices are becoming very active within our daily lives, within our normal healthcare settings. A lot of those devices, though, have challenges when we try to use them in clinical trials. They may not have the rigor or the reliability that's necessary for the analyses that we're going to do from a statistical assessment sense. They may not stand up to the rigor of regulatory review during market authorization applications. How do we set those standards? How do we define those? How do we help technology companies get to the state where those are effective in achieving that? How do we help regulators understand what's feasible, what's viable, and how to do that? And even as devices begin to get more and more prevalent, we know a lot of the devices now are based on motion sensing, things of that nature. But more and more of these devices are going to come out that will be biochemical sensors. They'll be more specifically tied to reliability to verify that they are truly tied to biochemical activities that are happening within the patient. And so how do those get mapped real time to these concepts and these regulations and the ability to adopt and use them? What about interactive response technology? Now, IRT is not in and of itself new. It's been used for more than a decade now. But as a result of those technologies, those themselves are changing too, because they're becoming gadget-based. They're beginning to be tied to devices and other things. And that might, especially in adaptive trial designs and so forth, it may rapidly respond to information that's coming from devices and others, and that technology will allow changes in treatment, dosing, those types of things, et cetera. How about home nursing? So how can home nursing be adopted? We know, again, with COVID-19 and the response that companies are making rapidly is having a huge impact on the ability to use home nursing. So how will regulations use that? How will they accept that information? How can it be used in lieu of on-site visits? Telemedicine is another example of that. So as we're using telemedicine, how does that get used? How do you make sure that you're being compliant? How do you make sure that you're meeting all the requirements of patient safety, of privacy, of all the things that relate to that, and so on? What about e-consent? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities with using the e-consent? Also, e-source. So as you're getting more of the devices, you're using the devices, but you're also getting e-source from electronic health records. How do you access the right information and guarantee that and prevent access to unintended information? How do you do so in a remote fashion so that you can do source data verification, perhaps in remote fashions that will be acceptable for Europe and others for privacy and things of that nature? And finally, but not least, again, the pragmatic trials, the use of real-world evidence, real-world data, more and more putting treatments into real-life settings. During the trials even that are happening with COVID right now, with multiple treatment options all being built into a single study, where depending on inclusion-exclusion criteria, patients can get mapped to multiple treatments from different sponsors all at the same time through different mechanisms of assessments and things of that nature. So these complex trial designs become what will become the focus of Annex 2. So remember, as Chrissy said, when we are thinking of this new E6R3, there's going to be a primary rewrite of the entire guidance. Simultaneously with that, there'll be a publishing of an Annex 1. The Annex 1 will focus on the traditional trials. Following that, at a later date, will be the publishing of Annex 2, but Annex 2 will be significantly driven by what I'm showing you here. Those innovative technologies then drive the enabling of, as I said, these new types of trials, decentralized trials or virtual trials, new trial designs, complex trials. So as we transition away from a centralized approach where there's one node or hub that does everything to a distributed, where there are nodes that have distributed work to subnodes, all the way to decentralized, where the nodes are only connected to the peers. How does that get managed? How do regulations support that? How do we influence the regulators to build the regulations that enable us to do what can achieve excellent trial design with the ability to have patient-safe data interpretability? Within the context of those, they're bringing in and building in the concepts of Bayesian Monte Carlo virtual trial designs. Now, this has been happening for a while, but again, the prevalence of them, the implications of them, and being built into phase 3 trials that are pivotal registration trials become more prevalent. The adoption of machine learning, artificial intelligence, what's the ability to do that? How can you do that? It ultimately provides the ability to manage and monitor massive volumes of data real time, very rapidly. So how can that be built into these, and how can regulations support it, and at the same time ensure the requirements, as we say, of patient safety, data interpretability. So those are all factors that are driving these new non-traditional interventional trials. So with all that framing of the drivers and the forces that are impacting this, we would like to actually then transition rapidly here to a few closing polling questions. And then we'll transition to a few closing slides before we actually then open up for Q&A. So as you think about what we just shared, what percentage of your current trials are non-traditional interventional clinical trials? So these adaptive trial designs, these using artificial intelligence, machine learning, using decentralized virtual concepts, using these technologies and so forth that we've just mentioned. So I'm going to transition to the poll itself. So I'm going to go from the slide deck to the actual poll. So again, what percentage of your trials are non-traditional interventional trials? I'm going to start the poll now. It is open. Leave it open for a short time longer as responses are still coming in. Okay, 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close it. We'll publish the results. Amazingly, 63% of the respondents indicate that 0 to 24% of your trials currently use these non-traditional approaches. There are 3% who are indicating that 100% of your trials are there. So some have moved into that setting. And then there's another range with 4% saying that 75 to 99% of their trials, 6% say that more than 50 to 74% of their trials, and then another 11% are indicating that 25 to 49%. Again, at this point, the regulators are recognizing that this is being adopted, but it is not yet fully accommodated in terms of the way people are doing trials. So we're going to transition to a second question. 5 years from now, by 2025, what percentage of your trials do you anticipate to actually then use the non-traditional interventional clinical trials? So I'm going to now open that next question, and it's, again, by 2025, what percent do you believe will use that? The poll is now open. Leave it open for another 5 seconds. Okay. I will close the poll, publish the results. Now, here, interestingly, but not surprisingly, a higher percentage feel that they will be adopting non-interventional trials. So 6% are at the 100% level, that 100% of your trials will have adopted it within 5 years. But then there's only 20% who are at 25 to 49% level, and only 16%, while it was 64% previously, indicate that 0 to 24%. So you can see at this point, the majority of you feel that at least a certain percentage of your trials will be using non-traditional approaches in your trials. So this, again, is where the agency, as they indicated in their horizon scanning, are recognizing that the technology is being adopted. They can no longer languish and be behind the 8 ball on evaluating and assessing these. So they are trying to be more proactive and looking at those as we progress to be able to accommodate those use when you need to use those. So we have a couple more quick polling questions. So what are the top 3 technologies or innovative approaches you have now or plan to incorporate into the clinical trials in the future? So this will help us, again, help influence the regulators so that they, as they prioritize these types of technologies and innovative approaches, that we can help them understand where they should do their prioritization and focus. So I'm now going to start the polling question that relates to that. Again, it is now open. What are the top 3 technologies or innovative approaches that you have now or plan to incorporate? Responses are coming in. I'm going to keep it open for a moment. Okay, 5 seconds, I will close the poll. Okay, I'm closing the poll, publishing the results. So quite a distribution across the use of these, with the largest being e-consent at 20%. Then there's going to be use of technologies like devices, adaptive trial designs, the IRT, e-source, even decentralized virtual trials, and real-world evidence, real-world device trials, or real-world data trials. Now, you realize, again, that you only have the ability to choose your top 3. So many of you may plan to use all of these, but as you consider the top ones that you want to use, those are the considerations. So I'm now going to move to one final polling question, and that is, what are the most significant barriers that you have to implementing new technologies within your organization? Is it the actual expense? Is it that they're not ideal for your patient population? Is it that you're not understanding how to qualify vendors to use those technologies or approaches? Is it unknown risk-benefit profile? Or are you uncertain of regulatory acceptance, which again becomes the heart and soul of what we're talking about now? But because of that uncertainty, does that impact it? So I'm going to now start the polling question. It is now open. Again, what are the most significant barriers to implementing those new technologies? I'll be polling or closing the poll in 5 seconds. All right, I'm closing the poll, publishing the results. At this point, you'll see that the highest percent is the uncertain regulatory acceptance, 27%. There is another 26% on the expense. Those are main drivers. 21% are indicating an unknown risk-benefit profile. So that'll be interesting for us to further evaluate and understand what that is. And then you'll see the other responses there as well. So we thank you very much for those polling questions, for your willingness and ability to respond to those. We're going to transition back to the slides, and I'm going to hand it off to Chrissy, who will do a few closing slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Chrissy?
Thanks, Steve. So in looking at those polling results, we looked at, now versus 5 years from now. And for me, I can't help but think it would have been interesting to even look at now versus 5 months ago. Because when considering timing, what's interesting to think about is that this concept paper was actually drafted in November 2019. So actually, well before the first known cases of COVID-19 were identified, and ultimately before there was this rapid uptake of decentralized clinical trials and use of technology in an industry that wasn't necessarily doing it 5 months ago. So while the regulators have rapidly released guidelines for the acute phase of the pandemic to aid sponsors in decision making, it'll be interesting how that affects the draft of this document. So some of the rapid changes in approach are a direct result of some of these policy changes. So an example of that would be allowing physicians to practice telemedicine across state lines. But one can only imagine that whoever was drafting ICH E6R3 on their desktop, you have to imagine there may have been quite a few track changes within that Word document as they wrote or rewrote some areas as they're seeing the difficulties and pain points that were really being realized in real time during this COVID shift. So what COVID's done is essentially change that risk profile that we just talked about in that previous polling question on using these different processes and approaches of conducting clinical trials. So what at one time seemed like too much of a risk to the unknown is now required if you don't want your trial to stall. So therefore, the risk-benefit profile has shifted, forcing the industry into using these technologies in order to ensure some sort of business continuity. And as a result, it actually might make ICH E6R3's release, particularly Annex 2, a little bit less jarring to the industry, and in fact, it actually may be released into an industry that's more informed on the risks and areas that they may need guidance on from regulators in terms of future perspectives. So the pharmaceutical industry has really long been aware that at some point there was going to be a major disruptor that would drastically change the way that we conduct clinical trials. And we've spoken about it at Avoca Quality Consortium meetings in the past, but oftentimes the guesses of what that disruptor was going to be was an Apple or a Google or some sort of large technology player that ultimately operates outside of the healthcare space. And what we've found is that it appears at this point in time that the disruptor for our industry today is COVID-19. And so while the disruptor has caused many organizations to pivot in order to continue moving forward with their clinical studies, we're also finding that it's providing some great opportunities. So opportunities for every player in the clinical trial landscape as individuals, but also more importantly for everyone to collaborate and move forward. So the Avoca Group, for instance, put together a rapid response working group to address the key challenges during COVID, such as documentation, source data review and verification, remote inspections, and really many other topics. And when the E3 draft guidance is released, we're actually going to be working within our collaboratives to provide feedback on behalf of our members during the comment period. And that's something that we can continue moving forward with, that continued collaborative approach to move the industry forward and work with our regulators to get feedback on the information that we need to continuously improve as an industry. In terms of individuals, the opportunities are equally as vast. So from providing regulators the opportunity to see real time the pain points or the gaps in their guidance that make implementing these technologies different, to allowing service providers the ability to showcase their technologies or new approaches that traditionally weren't well received by risk-averse organizations, all the way to ensuring that patients can continue clinical trials where they may be having a life-altering treatment. But it's clear that each player is benefiting in some way from the adoption of varying different paths forward through the disruption that's been caused by COVID-19. But we're all well aware that we can't operate clinical trials in a silo, no matter what approach that we take. So all the players that are listed on this slide are relevant to the continuing progress of these new technologies and innovative approaches. So Avoca has an innovation alliance, which was established to ensure the continuing progress is made with these new approaches to clinical trial execution. It's a collaborative that'll focus on the horizon scanning that Steve spoke about today to provide insights to really regulatory agencies on these innovative approaches and technologies, and to provide key tools for collaborative members to be able to implement those technologies throughout their organization. So really to help some of those pain points that we talked about during those polling questions. So that's what COVID has, likely done, our best guess in terms of what that's done to our regulatory impact on R3. But for now, what's the path forward for ICH E6R3? And in summary, the published concepts for the revision, as we talked about, are the complete rewrite of ICH E6R2, which will be those overarching principles and objectives, unified with Annex 1, which is going to incorporate those traditional interventional trials. Once Annex 1 is complete, we'll focus on Annex 2, which will have the focus on non-traditional interventional trials, which is defined as pragmatic clinical trials, decentralized clinical trials, and clinical trials that incorporate real-world data. And as we said, the rewrite is going to be in two waves. The first wave, which is the rewrite and Annex 1, is expected to be completed 18 to 24 months from the concept paper release, which was November 2019. And then Wave 2 is set to begin at the completion of Wave 1. So we're looking at somewhere around May 2021 to November 2021. So we've got a lot to prepare for in much less than 20 years that it took us to go from R1 to R2. But I believe that COVID-19 really has drastically changed how rapidly the adoption of these new technologies will be completed, especially when we get to Wave 2. I think we've had some quick access to these technologies to see how they can help and also how to mitigate any challenges we may have experienced. But it'll be great to see how quickly this industry can adapt from R2 to R3. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. We have a few moments to take any questions at this point in time, so please feel free to use the Q&A section there. And Steve, I welcome you to the conversation as well. If there's any questions that you want to address, that would be great.
Yeah, I think there are a few questions that I've highlighted that I think we can cover in the time allotted. One of them says that given that regulators tend to be precedent-driven, is it realistic to assume that they will be effective at accepting and incorporating novel technologies identified by horizon scanning? Will the slow process of legislation be able to keep up? Obviously, we all recognize the historical perspective that. I think this is exactly what we're seeing, though, with R3 coming along so rapidly after R2. The regulators and I think the leaders within the regulatory bodies now recognize that historical, precedent-driven, slow, languishing approach, and they are adapting. So I think if we as the industry do not adapt and become more part of an integrated process at collaborating with them, we will miss the opportunity to enable them to step forward and to be proactive in their thinking and to actually, again, as we've indicated, detect and know which of those technologies will have the greatest use, which will have the greatest impact for patients and for data interpretability, and therefore to assist them to focus on what matters the most. So I think we can do that. I think we can adjust with them and help them become more rapid, not only for their benefit, but for our benefit, and most importantly, for the benefit of the patients that can benefit from those types of trials. Another question that came in is, would you be able to provide a little history about the concept paper and where more detail can be obtained to be involved in the process with the FDA? It's not, my comment there is it's not just the FDA, it is all agencies. But as the voice of the industry, perhaps we can have real experiences and implementations. So again, I think we within the Avoca Group, because of our collaborative effort for the consortium, we are looking to see if there are ways that we can create a unified voice from the industry and that we can bring that together and have a greater face time and implication with the regulators and even more proactive thinking about what those might be. Beyond that, there's the historical approach. They will always publish draft versions of the guidances and allow individual companies or individuals to respond to that. Again, I think even those individual responses run the risk that they see multitudes of various responses and they don't see a unified response from the industry. So the more that we can come together through collaborative effort to give unified responses, I think that will be to everybody's benefit. Finally, just in closing, a very simple question as I look at the time, it says, Do you have suggestions for sites? This is investigative sites. So they're saying this is information that helps the sponsors and providers, but what about the sites as to how to incorporate some of these when so many of these are sponsor-driven? That's an interesting question. I think the more that site groups, the more, again, even within the consortium of Avoca and others, sites are becoming more active. So we do encourage the sites to have a voice, to be able to begin to engage in the collaborative inputs and the implications these technologies and innovative approaches have for them and for the patients. So there are many more questions. We will make our efforts to respond offline to those other questions as well. And so maybe in closing, just want to make sure that you're familiar with upcoming events and that there'll be opportunities to collaborate further on some of these topics and discussions. So Chrissy, if you want to close this and pass it back to Craig.
Yep, that's great. I just want to thanks everyone again. This is Dawn's information in case you wanted to get in contact with us about membership in either of the collaboratives that Avoca has or more information about the Avoca Group. But again, I want to thank you for your time. I know it is a busy era right now with what everyone's dealing with, so thank you for taking this hour of your time to talk about where the industry's headed with us. We greatly appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone, and please stay safe.
And thank you very much. And on behalf of CenterWatch and the Avoca Group, I'd like to thank our participants for joining us today. Be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes today's webinar. Have a great day and hope you join us again in the future.